Vic Goddard, this report that came out this morning, for general reflections firstly.
There's some really, clearly obvious stuff in there that we've probably known for a long time, that hits the mark. And there's a few things in there you wonder why it's in there, because it will take in mind. So there's a section about white privilege and how the teaching of that could be racist, etc. Just feels like a political point put in amongst some really important practical points. So, but there is a gap between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged outcomes. But I think there needs to be some insight into why, rather than cause and effect doesn't seem to be very clear.
And what if you were able to contribute to this document? What do you think are the answers?
I think some of the reports in there. I mean, children's centres. We had lots of children's centres in Harlow. They disappeared. Now we've got something called family hubs coming in. So I think they're probably the same. But let's not stop throwing things out that are working to replace them with things again. That would be my first point. There's been a lot of wasted money. I think there's an element of we focus on the number of students that go to university. We focus on the number of students achieving a certain grade. What there is no focus on is, well, do they actually leave as worthwhile citizens that contribute to their community? I would argue that a school that produces the plumbers, the bricklayers, the hair and beauty people, the carers is doing just a good job as that school that does the doctors and the doctors and the lawyers. However, as the report says, there are less schools in disadvantaged areas getting a good from Ofsted than there is in non-disadvantaged areas, so therefore it's easier to recruit in non-disadvantaged areas. So that needs to be tackled. That's been the case for the whole of my teaching career. It's still the case now, so we can't keep saying the same thing and do nothing different.
Do you ever want to say, I know you're a head teacher, not supposed to be political, do you ever want to say to the Robert Halfon, who also happens to be your MP here, say you do know you've been in power for 11 years, don't you?
I know. Do you know what? And the fact is that every government has this conversation. It's not just the Conservative government. I presented 10 years ago to Education Select Committee when the Conservative government had just got into coalition. Same outcomes. I think 10 years before that there was a similar one with the Labour Party in charge, similar outcomes. And what we have to accept, the fact is that we can't keep blaming schools. We've got to look at the wider system, and that's where the problems lie. The best teachers get the best results. How do you get the best teachers in the schools that serve the most disadvantaged areas? Well, that isn't by failing them at Ofsted, and that's part of the problem.
So what is this report basically at its heart? Do you interpret it, and other teachers interpret it, blaming schools?
It certainly feels like that. Yeah, it certainly feels like that. And I guess we're shy of that because of history. Ofsted comes into schools like this, and we had an outstanding a few years ago. We've been good with outstanding since. That's great. That's all I need. If they leave with a good, I know that I'll still be able to recruit teachers and I'll still be able to do something else. If we leave with a below good, it doesn't help this school become a better place. And so all of the systems that support schools need to be not punishing schools serving difficult areas. And we've been here, we choose to work in schools. Harlow has beautiful culture, the arts, everything else, but we talk about the educational disadvantage of our children. Until these children who leave with good outcomes and a good look on school become parents, it doesn't really change. It takes a generation to make a change. So it doesn't fit in 5-year cycles, Michael. I think that's part of the problem.
Do we know, for example, you mentioned 10 years ago, do you know how the students that left 10 years ago, do you know how they're getting on?
Yeah, well, interestingly, I mean, the figures they pull out are around English and maths, which is fine. But actually, if you look at the figures for young people who leave school and then go on into employment, education, training and stick in it, i.e. they start the right job and they stay in the right job, well, Harlow schools do well above average compared to the country. We do produce young people who go out as active citizens and get jobs. That should be celebrated above anything else. Rob's a massive advocate of apprenticeships. Less and less disadvantaged children are doing apprenticeships. So is that the school's issue or is that the system issue? And unfortunately, the only people measured for it are the schools. So where does the blame get put?
I keep hearing this term levelling up. So do you think what might happen indeed will probably abolish independent schools?
Or we're all independent, aren't we? Because that's what academies were supposed to be, Levelling up's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Because the report specifically says we want the government should stop talking about poverty being the biggest driver. Poverty is the biggest driver, and the reason why the governments talk about it is because it's true. However, it's still the same story as it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. So they need to do something different. anything that focuses on where young people aren't doing as well as others should be welcomed. But the reality is something different needs to be done.
People reading headlines or reading the first couple of lines might say, and I don't know this.
No.
Are they asking boys at your school or white boys at Harlow to apologise for being white?
Yeah, I think there's an element of I think the messaging around white and disadvantage is one that can limit aspirations, and that's something we need to be careful of. You know, there's the celebration of that kid who leaves school, goes on to get his plumbing qualifications and goes on to be a plumber, needs to be just as great as the kid who does that and goes on to be a doctor. And until we do that, towns like Harlow, who are producing good, solid, working class people in working class families, don't feel that they're as important as those that are coming from Cambridge and etc., then the aspiration for young men to do anything different is going to be a challenge. So it's not a one size fits all. It's not a one thing we can change that needs to do everything. It needs to be a collective effort where blame needs to not be constantly the thing that drives us. Failure is, we have a system that is driven by failure. You fail an Ofsted, you get loads of things thrown at you and things change. But it needs to be driven by success. These young people went off and they've got jobs and they are contributing to society. Let's celebrate those rather than not celebrate them because they didn't get a 5 in their English.